I see that you have committed to the Sunbreaker. You decided that the direct approach of punching and swinging your way through groups of enemies is the approach that suits you. Well then, I hope to cover everything you would need to know about the Sunbreaker in order to start making builds or to beef up your general game knowledge. A disclaimer before we begin. Destiny is a game that constantly changes and evolves. As such, the information in this video may become less accurate the further in the future you are watching this. Therefore, I would always double check to ensure that the information presented is still accurate. Without further ado, let's get into the video. Before we get into the specifics of Sunbreaker, I think it's important to get an overview of the Solar subclass in general. Solar is one of the three Light subclasses alongside Void and Arc. Solar in the current sandbox is incredibly potent. It contains everything that you would want in a PvE environment. It has two verbs which assist with healing, a verb that is a straight up damage buff, and it has a damage over time and add clear verbs as well. Therefore, it is incredibly versatile and contains a lot of what you would need to cover every single PvE scenario. The only tool that it does not have is a way to debuff enemies, but taking into account everything else, it's safe to say that this isn't much of a negative. Now that we have a rough overview on the Solar subclass, let's begin by defining the subclass verbs that is relevant for Solar. Firstly, let's talk about Restoration. Restoration has two tiers, Restoration X1 and Restoration X2. This buff will constantly heal your health as long as the buff is active. Restoration X1 heals for 35 HP per second, and Restoration X2 heals you for 50 HP per second. The duration of restoration can be affected by fragments, such as the Ember of Solace and the Ember of Empyrean. The next one to talk about is Cure. Cure also gives healing similarly to Restoration. The only difference being is that Cure restores a big chunk of HP in one go, instead of giving health over time. Cure restores 60 HP per stack of Cure. However, keep in mind that after Cure activates, there is a 1 second cooldown where activating Cure again will not heal you. An example of this is Ember of Solace and Phoenix Dive. If your grenade kills an enemy while you have Ember of Solace and your Phoenix Dive activates less than a second after the grenade kill, you will not be able to receive the healing from Phoenix Dive as it is a cure. The final buff that Solar has is Radiant. Radiant is a buff that gives your weapons increased damage. You will get a 25% damage boost as long as Radiant is active. Not only that, being Radiant will also give weapons that do not have any champion counters the ability to stun barrier champions. The two verbs that you can apply to enemies that are linked to Solar is Scorch and Ignite. Let's talk about these together as they are related to each other, and Ignite relies on Scorch to activate. Enemies that are inflicted by Scorch takes damage over time. This damage lingers for 4.5 seconds and then starts decreasing at a rate of 5.67 stacks every 0.56 seconds until the enemy has no Scorch stacks remaining. If you manage to apply 100 stacks of Scorch on an enemy, they will ignite. Ignitions will create an explosion that deals 750 damage to any enemies within a 10-meter radius of the ignited enemy. This explosion has no damage falloff. Ignition damage can be increased if the Scorch damage that caused the ignition also has a damage increase. Any unstoppable champions that receives ignition damage will also be stunned. The class-specific pickup that the Solar subclass use is the Fire Sprite. Fire Sprites restore 12.5% grenade energy upon pickup. Allies are not able to pick up Fire Sprites that you generate, and they will last for around 25 seconds. There is a 5-second cooldown between generating Fire Sprites. Now that we have explained all the Solar verbs and pickups, let's continue by talking about the Solar grenades, as this is also shared by all the other Solar subclasses. Firebolt grenades shoots beams of solar energy at up to 4 enemies within an 8.5 meter radius on impact. It applies 20 Scorch stacks. It will deal 10 more Scorch stacks if you have the Embers of Ashes fragments. From now on, I will follow the format of saying 20 plus 10 Scorch stacks, with the former number being the amount of Scorch it applies without the fragment, and the latter number being how much more Scorch stacks the fragment adds on. It has a base cooldown of 64 seconds. Fusion grenades will stick on an enemy and then explode after a short time. The grenade has some tracking and will sometimes magnetize towards an enemy as well. It will apply 40 plus 20 Scorch stacks on detonation and has a base cooldown of 73 seconds. Healing grenades will apply Cure X1 and Restoration X1 to anybody within the range of the grenade impact. If you or an ally is not within the grenade's impact radius, it will spawn a white glowing pickup that applies Restoration X1 if you go near it. It has a base cooldown of 91 seconds. Incendiary grenades will apply 60 plus 30 scorch on detonation. The incendiary grenade will do more damage if it explodes underneath or nearby an enemy. It has a base cooldown of 105 seconds. Solar grenades create a scorching field on impact. It does 11 plus 10 scorch on detonation, and then 9 plus 5 scorch stacked for each second that an enemy stood inside of it. The base cooldown is 152 seconds. Swarm grenades creates 9 seeking drones on impact that will lock onto nearby enemies. Each drone does 5 plus 3 scorch stacks on detonation. The base cooldown is 91 seconds. Thermite grenades creates 4 waves of fire, one after the other. Each wave of fire will apply 10 plus 10 stacks of scorch. The base cooldown is 121 seconds. The final grenade is the tripmine grenade. This will stick on a surface and then explode when an enemy is near. It applies 40 plus 20 stacks of scorch on detonation, and it has a base cooldown of 121 seconds. The Sunbreaker has access to 2 melees, Hammer Strike and Throwing Hammer. Hammer Strike is a shoulder strike that does 487 base impact damage and 216 base AoE damage. It applies 40 plus 20 scorch on hit, and any enemies killed by this melee will ignite. The base cooldown is 91 seconds. Throwing Hammer is a thrown melee that does 597 base impact damage. The melee will fully recharge if you pick up the hammer after it has been thrown. It does take 1.4 seconds to recharge after it has been picked up. If you do not pick up the hammer for 10 seconds after it has been thrown, it will explode. Picking up this hammer after you hit an enemy will grant you Cure X1. The final quirk with this melee is that any titan with a throwing hammer melee can pick up a hammer off the ground, even if it's not yours, which will count as being picked up to all titans within a small radius. The base cooldown is also 91 seconds. Now let us move on to the class abilities, which the Sunbreaker has access to 2: Towering Barricade and Rally Barricade. Towering Barricade creates a wall of light that blocks all incoming damage. Both barricades grant a 20% damage resist during the cast animation and last 20 seconds with 500 HP. The base cooldown is 48 seconds. Rally Barricade deploys a smaller barricade that grants 30 stability, 100 reload speed, 0.9x reload duration multiplier, 10% increased damage falloff, and 50% flinch resistance. The base cooldown is 38 seconds. Let's round off this ability review with the Sunbreaker supers, Burning Maul and Hammer of Soul. Both supers grant you 90% damage resistance. Burning Maul has a base duration of 25 seconds or 4% of your super per second. With a Soul Invictus aspect, it creates a sunspot on cast if grounded, and reduces the passive super drain by 40%. Increasing the duration to 42 seconds or 2.4% of your super per second. The light attack drains 4% of your super energy and is a spinning attack that deals 111 base damage 4 times. It has a 0.67 second delay between light attacks. Continuously scoring hits will grant 40% increased attack speed until you stop scoring hits. Scoring 10 hits with the light attack spawns a Cyclone. You can only spawn 1 Cyclone per super activation. The heavy attack drains 8% super energy. You slam the hammer down, releasing a homing projectile that explodes on impact, dealing 276 damage and creating a Cyclone. Cyclones deal 20 base damage every 0.2 seconds and will apply 3 plus 2 Scorch stacks every 0.56 seconds. The base cooldown is 500 seconds. Hammer of Soul has a base duration of 21 seconds or 4.75% of your super per second. This duration is reduced to 16.5 seconds or 6.06% of your super per second if Soul Invictus is currently equipped. Since Hammer of Soul has different values when Soul Invictus is equipped, I will explain base Hammer of Soul first and then explain the changes that are caused by Soul Invictus. Your light attack throws a hammer that drains 12% of your super energy. This hammer explodes on impact, dealing up to 386 base damage. There is a 1.5 second delay between hammer throws. Impacts release 3 shrapnels, dealing 286 base damage each. Hammers visually flare up every 0.5 seconds it remains airborne, increasing the amount of shrapnel on impact up to a maximum of 6. With Phoenix Cradle, the passive drain is reduced by 20%, increasing the duration to 26.56 seconds or 3.81% super drain per second. Light attacks drain 7.5% super energy, and the delay between hammer throws is decreased to 1 second. With Lorelei Splendor, it decreases the super passive drain by 40%, increasing the duration up to 35 seconds or 3.63% of your super per second. Light attacks drain 8.2% of your super, and the delay between hammer throws is decreased to 1 second. With Soul Invictus, it creates a sunspot on Supercast if you are grounded. Your light attacks drain 9% super energy and creates a sunspot on impact. Standing in a sunspot decreases passive super drain by 40%, increasing its duration to 27.5 seconds or 3.63% of your super per second. Light attacks drain 5.5% super energy, and the delay between hammer throws is decreased to 1 second. The base cooldown is 556 seconds. Alright, we have covered all of the abilities that are available to a Sunbreaker. Let's talk about things that may add more abilities or modify existing abilities, which are aspects and fragments. I will cover the aspects first. Sunbreakers have access to 3 aspects, giving you 2 fragment slots each. You may freely choose 2 to use at any given time. These aspects are Soul Invictus, Roaring Flames, and Consecration. Soul Invictus allows solar ability kills, scorched enemy kills, and Hammer of Soul impacts to create sunspots. Standing in a sunspot refreshes its duration, and they have a maximum lifespan of 12 seconds. Standing in a sunspot grants Soul Invictus for 5 seconds. This grants Restoration X1, 40% reduced passive super drain, and 100% additional grenade and melee regeneration rate. Sunspots also deal 60 base damage and applies 5+3 Scorch every 0.16 seconds. Roaring Flames allow solar ability kills and ignitions to grant a stack of Roaring Flames up to a maximum of 3 stacks. Each Roaring Flame stack increases ability damage for 20 seconds. The value of each stack is shown on the screen, alongside the reduced values when paired with biotic enhancements from Syntheseps or Burning Fist from Wormgod's Caress. Melee hits while Roaring Flames is active applies 30+10 Scorch and counts as a powered melee hit. This does not apply to the Throwing Hammer. Consecration allows you to use a new melee while sliding. If you activate your powered melee while sliding, you will launch into the air while sending a wave of solar energy 17.5 meters forward. This wave deals 90 base damage and applies 40+20 Scorch. This consumes 50% of your melee ability energy. Activating your powered melee ability before you land will cause you to slam the ground and consume the rest of your melee energy, creating a second wider wave of solar energy that travels 14.5 meters and deals 1080 base damage. Hits against scorched enemies with the second wave causes them to ignite, dealing 1050 base damage. It grants 25% damage resistance against non-melee damage while in the melee animation. Now we move on to the final part of this deep dive into the Sunbreaker, which are the fragments. Sunbreakers share the same fragments with the other 2 solar subclasses, Gunslingers and Dawnblades. If you already know what these fragments do by watching those subclass breakdowns, then you may feel free to skip this section. I will try to cover all the fragments concisely but still delivering the relevant details to you. I will also note any stat buffs or debuffs that the fragments confer to you on the screen. Let's begin alphabetically with the Ember of Ashes. The Ember of Ashes allows you to apply 50% more Scorch to enemies, as denoted by all the times in this video where I have mentioned a plus when talking about how much Scorch stacks an ability applies. Note that some sources of Scorch do not follow this 50% buff, such as Caliban's Hand, Tommy's Matchbook, and Skyburner's Oath. Ember of Beams causes solar super projectiles to home in on enemies. This does not seem to affect Hammer of Soul hammers or cyclones. The Ember of Benevolence causes applying Cure, Radiant, Restoration, Healing, or Reviving allies to grant 400% additional base grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration rate for 6 seconds. Note that Empowering Rifts and the Aeon Sect of Vigor's triggered healing will not cause the Ember of Benevolence to activate. The Ember of Blistering causes ignition kills to grant grenade ability energy based on enemy rank. Tier 1 combatants grant 8%, Tier 2 12.25%, Tier 3 6.5%, and Tier 4 combatants 25%. The Ember of Char applies 40+20 Scorch to enemies damaged by the explosions from ignitions. This does not apply to the ignited enemy. The Ember of Combustion causes solar super kills to cause ignitions and spawn a fire sprite. The Well of Radiance causes all weapon damage to count as super ability damage for the caster. The Ember of Empyrean extends restoration and radiant effects by 4 seconds per kill. This duration cannot exceed 12 seconds. The Ember of Eruption causes your ignitions to have around a 20% increase in its explosion radius. The Ember of Mercy grants Restoration X1 for 2 seconds upon picking up a fire sprite. When you revive an ally, it will grant you and any allies nearby Restoration X1 for 5 seconds. The Ember of Resolve causes your grenade kills to grant Cure X1. The Ember of Searing allows killing scorched enemies to grant you powered melee energy based on enemy rank and spawns a fire sprite. Tier 1 combatants grant 8%, Tier 2 12.25%, Tier 3 16.5%, and Tier 4 combatants 25%. The Ember of Singeing will grant 300% additional base class ability regeneration rate for 3 seconds after applying Scorch to enemies. This will not affect if the enemy dies from the hit that would have applied the Scorch. The Ember of Solace causes restoration and radiant effects to last 50% longer. The Ember of Tempering allows solar weapon kills to grant plus 10 recovery for you and allies within 12.5 meters for 8 seconds. This can stack up to 3 times. While the Ember of Tempering is active, it grants plus 20 airborne effectiveness, and solar weapon kills spawn a fire sprite. The Ember of Torches causes powered melee hits to make you and allies within 8 meters radiant for 8 seconds. Lastly, the Ember of Wonder allows killing 2 enemies rapidly with ignitions to create an orb of power that grants 2.5% super energy. This will incur a 10-second cooldown upon creating an orb of power. That should cover everything you need to know about the Sunbreaker. I will leave a link to the Destiny Data Compendium if you want to perform further research. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and enable notifications to ensure that you do not miss any of my uploads. The next guide will be posted next Thursday and will be covering weapon crafting. The next episode in this subclass breakdown series will be released on the 11th of January, covering the Voidwalker. Thank you for watching and happy farming.